I was grabbing coffee with a friend the other day, and the conversation turned to history, specifically, the atrocities of the mid-20th century. He got incredibly intense, leaning across the table with this look of genuine disbelief and frustration. He kept saying things like, I just don't get how people stood by. If I were there, he said, I would have been in the resistance. I would have hidden people in my basement. And he wasn't just saying it. You could tell he really, truly felt it. To him, his moral compass is this fixed object, something that would point north no matter what year he was born in. He sees himself as someone who naturally sees through the crowd, an individual who would, instinctively reject cruelty. But then I decided to test that confidence. I asked him to shift his imagination back to 1450, to the Aztec Empire. I said, imagine you're a father. Your neighbor knocks on your door and tells you the priests have chosen your son for the ceremony. They're going to take him up the temple and cut out his heart while it's still beating to ensure the sun rises. How do you feel? And, well, without missing a beat, his expression just hardened. I'd be sick, he said instantly. I'd fight them to the death to save my kid. He looked so proud of that answer, treating it as proof of his inherent goodness. But that reaction actually revealed something much more unsettling. His absolute certainty that he would be the hero didn't prove he would have been a rebel in 1450. It only proved that he is perfectly, statistically normal in 2024. He failed to realize that if he were truly a neurotypical human in Aztec society, someone with a healthy, functioning brain who connects with his community, he wouldn't be fighting the priest. He would be thanking him.
That is, wow. That opening anecdote is the perfect, and I have to say, deeply uncomfortable starting point for this deep dive.
Right.
Because this conversation isn't really about individual character or moral exceptionalism or some kind of internal goodness. It's fundamentally about statistics. It's about the devastating, quantifiable cost of being statistically average.
And that's what we've been digging into. We've spent time gathering this deeply challenging body of evidence, psychological studies, historical analysis, even modern definitions of neurodivergence. And it all forces us to confront what the word normal actually means. Our sources are incredibly clear on this. Normal isn't about morality. It is purely and simply math.
And that is our mission today. We're going to thoroughly examine that definition. We're going to define neurotypical not as correct or healthy, but purely as statistically common.
Yeah.
From there, we'll explore the profound and honestly terrifying implications of that definition across history, behavioral psychology, and even modern societal structures. Think corporate governance, clinical diagnosis.
Ultimately, we're setting out to prove, through the data, that the statistical average human, they often prioritize obedience, role performance, and group consensus over any individual moral framework they might have.
And this pattern seems to hold true no matter the context.
So to start, we really have to just dispense with the comforting, deeply ingrained definition of normal that most of us carry around.
We have to. The sources make it explicit. The common, comfortable assumption that normal means right or healthy or optimal that has to be discarded immediately.
That's the definition that lets my friend confidently believe he'd be a hero in any time period.
Exactly. It's the first hurdle, isn't it? We use normal as a shorthand for good. If a brain functions normally, we just assume it automatically resists cruelty, or that it recognizes injustice on some fundamental level.
But to be intellectually honest here, we have to strip away that moral veneer entirely.
The actual clinical psychological definition is purely statistical. It's mathematical. Neurotypical simply means someone whose patterns of behavior, of cognition, of reaction, they match the statistical average for their population.
It's just an observation.
Just an observation. It's like measuring the central tendency in any other biological data set. It's a measure of statistical conformity, nothing more.
So if the average response time for a given stimulus in a population is, say, X, and your response time is X, you're neurotypical for that specific response.
Right. And to take it further, if the average cultural response to a threat is Y, and your response is also Y, then you are neurotypical for that culture.
And that second point is so crucial. This definition has a massive qualifier for their population.
Yes. This means that normal, statistically speaking, is entirely context dependent. What is statistically common, what is normal in one society? It could be functionally pathological or statistically rare in another.
So neurodivergent in another.
Exactly. And the moral content of the action is completely irrelevant to the label.
Okay, so let's apply this crucial, uncomfortable redefinition right back to the Aztec Empire in 1450. We can use the social psychology data we have on conformity from that period to map the neurotypical behavior pattern of an average citizen.
Okay, so their entire cultural structure was predicated on this belief that the gods demanded human blood sacrifice. This wasn't some, fringe practice.
No, it was the foundation of the state.
The absolute foundation. It ensured the sun rose, the rains came, the crops grew. So what was statistically common, and we're talking likely above 95% conformity, was a deep belief in the system.
Active participation.
Active participation in the rituals, feeling profound pride and gratitude when your family was chosen for this ultimate honor, and just the unwavering acceptance of the priesthood's authority.
So the statistical truth is that if you were a normal human, a neurotypical adult embedded in that culture, your brain would have adapted. It would have been conditioned to feel those responses.
You would have completely internalized that system. Your personal moral structure would have been, in a way, subsumed by the social structure.
Right. Now let's consider the outlier, the statistical minority. The person who felt that genuine, overwhelming horror your friend described.
The one who questioned the gods, who tried to fight the priest.
Yeah. In 1450, that person's pattern of behavior was statistically rare. They were the 1 in 20 person. By our definition, that individual would have been neurodivergent in Aztec society.
And that's not because they possessed a broken brain. It's because their behavior pattern was the minority statistic.
And here's the profound switch. When we drop that horror-filled refuser into modern America, they instantly become neurotypical.
Because 95% of us conform to non-sacrifice.
And the priest, the celebrant of the systematic killing, is now the statistical minority. He's the neurodivergent outlier.
The insight there, and it's worth repeating because it really challenges our intuition, is that the same intrinsic patterns of refusal or acceptance, they switch labels entirely.
All based on the local statistical consensus.
Exactly. Neurotypicality measures prevalence, regardless of the inherent moral weight of the prevailing action.
This brings us to the agonizing story of Tlaquelel, the Aztec shoemaker. This specific historical account gives us the perfect lens to view the crushing weight of societal norms against an individual moral framework.
It's a case study in how the conformity machine wins.
So tell us about him.
Tlaquelel was a devoted father. He had that visceral, biological, individual moral impulse to protect his youngest son. You can imagine it.
Of course.
But his community wasn't just asking for a sacrifice. They were in the midst of a severe drought. The collective anxiety was existential.
This wasn't a hypothetical. This was survival.
Total survival. The authority, the priesthood, they dictated that the tears and blood of the innocent were required to save the entire city from starvation and doom.
So the sources describe his internal conflict as this battle between two different kinds of morality.
That's right. One was the intimate personal loyalty to his child. The other was the vast, overwhelming loyalty to the collective survival, which was enforced by the authority structure.
And the social cost of deviance.
Oh, it would have been immense, being the one man who, through his perceived selfishness, condemned the city and his surviving family to starvation and social ostracism. That was a far greater, heavier weight than his personal grief.
So in that cultural moment, conformity was survival. It was equated with sanity.
Yes. The neurotypical response was to recognize the authority, comply with the collective necessity, and sacrifice the individual, the child, for the sake of the collective, the community.
And this isn't about a lack of empathy.
Not at all. Yeah. It's about the crushing, overwhelming pressure to comply with the fear of the majority when authority dictates it. That makes compliance the statistically normal action. Tlaquelel handed his son over.
His personal morals were absolutely pulverized by the societal survival instinct.
They were.
So if statistical normal can demand obedience to such an extremity, the next question is unavoidable. What does the data tell us about our average today? In our modern, liberal, and ostensibly individualistic context, how often do we actually conform when we're placed under controlled, stressful pressure?
And that's where we leave the ancient historical context and move directly into the cold, quantitative environment of the psychological laboratory.
We're looking at classic landmark studies that created these high-pressure micro-societies to quantify exactly how often average neurotypical people conform to authority, roles, and group consensus.
And we absolutely have to start with the Milgram obedience to authority experiments. To really grasp the significance of this data, you have to immerse yourself in the scenario of teacher L.
Okay, so this was an ordinary participant, right?
Right.
Recruited via a newspaper ad.
Totally ordinary. They arrive at a prestigious institution like Yale University, expecting to be in a study on memory.
And they get placed in the role of teacher. In the room next door, the learner, who's actually an actor, is strapped into a chair.
And the experimenter, this is key, a scientist in a lab coat, representing the unquestionable authority of science, instructs a teacher to administer escalating electric shocks for every incorrect answer.
The voltage ranged from 15 volts all the way up to a lethal 450 volts, labeled XXX.
We need to slow down and detail the progression here, because this is where the distress and the subsequent conformity really manifested. After 150 volts, the learner starts screaming that he has heart trouble and demands to be let out.
At 300 volts, the actor bangs desperately on the wall.
And then after 330 volts, complete, chilling silence.
The participants, the teachers, they were physically distressed. Accounts detail them sweating, trembling, laughing nervously, arguing with the experimenter.
Begging to stop. But the experimenter never used force. He only used these verbal prods. The experiment requires that you continue, or the critical final demand. You have no other choice. You must go on.
So he framed continuation as a societal necessity. The authority of science demanded it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the result? It remains one of the most terrifying findings in human behavioral psychology. 65% of ordinary participants administered shocks all the way to 450 volts.
So two-thirds. Two-thirds of average, normal, neurotypical people were willing to shock a screaming, pleading person into silence and apparent death, simply because an authority figure told them it was necessary for the structure of the experiment.
It's staggering.
It is, but it's important to challenge this data point, though. What about the 35% who didn't go all the way? Doesn't that prove the power of individual morality? Why is the focus always on the two-thirds?
That's a critical question, and it's a fair one. The 35% who resisted, they often possessed unique internal frameworks, maybe a different cognitive profile that made them less responsive to external authority cues, or perhaps they had prior experiences that fostered resistance. We don't know for sure.
But the key insight for our deep dive is the statistical norm.
It has to be.
Yeah.
The majority response, the neurotypical response, was compliance. The data showed that the average person's moral compass, when pitted against a powerful authority structure, failed 65% of the time.
And this obedience tendency, it's not universal, but it is amplified in specific contexts. You mentioned earlier the work was motivated by the Holocaust.
It was. And while there are complex variables, and we have to be careful not to draw a direct one-to-one line, the data clearly supports the idea that obedience to authority is a psychological tendency.
And it gets amplified.
It gets amplified in cultures with a strong authority orientation, where deference to hierarchies is highly valued. We see this in certain historical contexts, like pre-Nazi Germany or during the Rwandan genocide. That 65% result is a stark measure of how easily the majority can be mobilized by a legitimate authority structure.
So if Milgram showed obedience to authority, then the Stanford Prison Experiment showed us the breathtaking speed of conformity to roles.
Yes, the SPE. This was another attempt to create a micro-society. It was intended to run for 14 days using normal, psychologically healthy college students who were randomly assigned as guards or prisoners.
And they were given minimal instructions. Guards were just told to maintain order, no physical violence permitted. That was it.
But the roles, they just captured the behavior almost instantly.
The study had to be stopped after just 6 days.
6 days. Because the psychological abuse was so severe. Within 36 hours, a blink of an eye, the guards began engaging in systemic psychological torture.
Humiliation, forced sexualized chants, waking them up in the middle of the night for roll calls.
Making them clean toilets with their bare hands. Prisoners had emotional breakdowns. Several had to be released early. It was a complete disaster.
And the terrifying insight is that these were not sadistic individuals selected for their evil traits.
No, they were screened for that. They were average, healthy college students. They simply conformed to the expectations of the role.
So when you're given a role that permits abuse, even without being explicitly told to abuse, most average people will readily seize and use that power.
The role provides the rationale. Conforming to the role becomes the new, immediate, normal behavior in that micro-society.
Okay, so that's authority and roles. Finally, we have to look at the Asch Conformity Experiments, which quantify conformity to group consensus, regardless of observable reality.
This is the least stressful scenario of the three, but the results are, in their own way, equally demoralizing.
The setup is just beautiful in its simplicity. A line-matching vision test.
You're in a room with a group of people. A group of 7 Confederates, instructed by the researcher, unanimously state the obviously, undeniably wrong answer, like matching a 10-inch line to a 5-inch line.
Something you can clearly see is wrong.
Blatantly wrong. The actual participant answers last. The choice is between reality and social awkwardness.
And the finding is it's staggering. 75% of participants conformed and gave the wrong answer at least once.
They denied the evidence of their own eyes just to match the group.
And a third of them, 32%, conformed repeatedly across multiple trials.
Think about that. The average brain would rather lie about a visible line than risk social awkwardness or the feeling of standing out.
And when they were asked why, the answers were so telling. I didn't want to stand out, or I thought maybe I was seeing it wrong since everyone else agreed.
They prioritized social belonging being statistically normal over observable truth.
So when we synthesize the statistical profiles of these 3 major definitive studies, Milgram, Stanford, and Asch, we get a composite image of the average neurotypical human.
What does that image look like?
They obey authority 65% of the time, they conform to roles in under 36 hours, and they match group consensus 75% of the time.
Which brings us full circle, right back to the Aztec temple. The priest demanding the child wasn't driven by some unique strain of evil.
No, he was operating through the exact same psychological mechanisms that drove modern participants in these 3 studies.
Authority commanded it, his role required it, and the entire group normalized it.
The pattern holds. In any context, no matter what. The statistical average human is fundamentally an efficient conformity machine.
So if the data confirms that average people will conform to cruelty, the next logical, and I think vital, question is how? How do they manage to execute harmful or unethical acts without suffering catastrophic guilt, without viewing themselves as monsters?
Right, because they don't just suddenly lose their conscience.
No, they learn to bypass it.
Yeah.
And this process of bypassing your conscience is known as moral disengagement.
It's not just ignoring your conscience, it's an active cognitive reframing process where you convince yourself that ethical standards just don't apply in this specific context.
Exactly. It separates your moral reaction, your empathy, your sense of personal responsibility from inhumane conduct. It's essentially cognitive self-exoneration.
So you can maintain your core belief that you are a good person, but you just suspend your ethical standards for the moment, viewing the destructive behavior as necessary or acceptable.
And we see this all the time. Situational pressure often overwhelms genuine internal moral concern. And critically, the sheer passivity and silence of bystanders allows the situation to evolve into something violent or destructive.
The sources we looked at provide a really detailed and honestly a somewhat horrifying playbook for how this is achieved. We should probably walk through the specific mechanisms people use, consciously or not, to rationalize their conformity and bypass their internal moral checkpoints.
The first mechanism is moral justification. This one is crucial because it reframes the act itself. You portray harmful behavior as having a higher, often lofty moral purpose.
So instead of admitting you're torturing someone, you justify it as a necessary evil to protect national security or to maintain order.
Precisely. We see this historically applied in extreme destructive ideology. By elevating the action to a noble goal, preserving the race, saving the community from a perceived threat, achieving scientific progress, self-censure is eliminated. What was once seen as condemnable is now a source of self-valuation.
Okay, what's next?
Next is euphemistic labeling. This is all about using sanitized, harmless language to disguise harmful acts. It reduces the emotional weight and makes the act seem respectable, which diminishes personal guilt. The language hides the reality.
Right. You think of military or government lexicon. No one kills civilians. They inflict collateral damage. Nobody is fired. It's a career transition.
Or in wartime, soldiers don't murder the enemy. They neutralize or waste them. This passive, clean language allows the actor to distance themselves from the physical reality of the harm they cause. The sources also mention the passive voice, which can remove the agent entirely.
Like a driver saying, the telephone pole was approaching when it struck my front end, instead of taking accountability for steering the vehicle.
Exactly that. Third, we have advantageous comparison. This is where you trivialize your own destructive act by comparing it to something even worse. By exploiting the contrast principle, the perpetrator makes their behavior seem minor or even necessary.
A geopolitical example might be a state minimizing its own severe intervention in a conflict by arguing they're saving the populace from communist enslavement, implying that the alternative would have been absolute devastation.
Or even in a minor corporate context, An employee might rationalize padding an expense account by saying, well, at least I'm not doing what the CEO did, which was steal millions. Your bad act looks less bad next to a truly heinous act.
Okay, so then we move to the mechanisms of accountability avoidance.
The first of those is displacement of responsibility. This is blaming a legitimate authority for your actions. The individual views their own behavior as being dictated by someone else, making them a conduit rather than the source of the ethical lapse. This is pure self-exoneration.
This is exactly what Milgram's participants did. The ones who continued were desperate for the researcher to confirm, the responsibility is mine.
As soon as the experimenter accepted liability, the participant felt licensed to continue shocking because they were just following orders. They were functioning within a mandated social structure.
And closely related to that is diffusion of responsibility.
Right. This happens in groups or through a division of labor. When accountability for a harmful decision is shared widely, each individual feels significantly less culpable. Collective action provides anonymity, which weakens moral control.
We see this in highly bureaucratic processes. No single person pulls the final lever. One person compiles the data, another writes the recommendation, a third authorizes the budget, and a fourth executes the order.
And everyone in that chain can plausibly say, I only did my small part. The decision wasn't mine alone. The blame shared and therefore diluted.
Okay, there are two more, right?
Yes. The sixth mechanism is distortion of consequences. This involves minimizing, ignoring, or outright misrepresenting the negative effects of one's actions. If the harm isn't clearly visible or easily quantifiable, it becomes much easier to dismiss.
This seems crucial in environmental or financial misconduct where the victim is distant or abstract. A company polluting a distant river might dismiss the health consequences by saying, the damage is negligible, or the benefits outweigh the minor costs.
You're avoiding confronting the actual suffering caused by your action. And finally, the seventh mechanism, and perhaps the most damaging, is dehumanization.
This is denying victims their humanness, their rationality, warmth, or emotional capacity to justify immoral treatment.
If the victim isn't seen as a full human being, they are excluded from the perpetrator's moral universe.
This is a devastating historical tool. The Nazi regime compared Jews to rats. That's animalistic dehumanization.
And modern political rhetoric sometimes characterizes opponents or marginalized groups as robots or soulless bureaucrats, which is mechanistic dehumanization. Once the target is outside your moral circle, anything done to them is justifiable because they are not perceived to be suffering in the same way a normal human would.
And this systematic process of justification, it isn't just for grand historical atrocities.
Not at all. It is entirely prevalent in modern organizational life, where it manifests as something called ethical fading.
Ethical fading. That's the gradual recession of ethical considerations from the forefront of awareness.
Right. Due to cognitive biases and situational pressures, a decision that has clear ethical implications is gradually reframed purely in financial, legal, or technical terms, omitting the ethical relevance entirely.
And this systemic failure operates on multiple levels. So at the individual level, executives experience moral disengagement alongside what's called bounded ethicality.
Bounded ethicality refers to the psychological process where, due to external pressures or complexity, individuals subconsciously omit ethical considerations. This allows them to act against their own values while preserving a moral self-concept.
That's fascinating. So what specific cognitive biases underpin that? It sounds like people are simply lying to themselves without even realizing it.
In a way, yes. One major element is the self-serving bias. When evaluating ambiguous ethical situations, people tend to interpret facts and norms in ways that benefit their self-interest or the organization's interest. They subconsciously believe their own actions are morally superior to others, allowing them to dismiss potential conflicts.
And another is framing, right? How the problem is presented.
Absolutely. If an executive sees a decision framed as a cost-cutting measure, they're far less likely to see it as a harmful cut to safety.
So the average successful person in a high-pressure environment is constantly running these justification algorithms and using biases to protect their self-image while pursuing their role-defined goals.
Which leads directly to the group level, where ethical blindness is reinforced by team dynamics. Loyalty norms within executive teams often override individual moral judgment. If the team leader or the majority takes an unethical path, subordinates will engage in groupthink, rationalizing the misconduct to maintain cohesion.
And that gets amplified by ethical contagion, the everyone does it defense.
Yes, and we have to talk about the silence. Complicity is often passive.
So this idea of strategic silence is critical. Executives who recognize misconduct will often refrain from challenging it, especially when it's framed as being pro-organizational benefiting the company.
And that silence can be supportive, reflecting implicit agreement, or it can be quiescent, driven by fear of retaliation. In either case, it creates a facade of consensus, suppressing dissent and reinforcing the deviant norm. The silence of the average majority normalizes the unethical actions of the powerful few.
And finally, the organizational level. When performance-driven incentives align with unethical practices, hitting aggressive sales targets, cutting corners for profit, and these decisions become routine, we get the normalization of deviance.
And this is the institutionalization of the average ethical lapse. Questionable practices become standard procedures. Compliance programs and written policies are insufficient because the organization's informal, actual moral norms adapt to support the behavior of its most powerful members.
So if an unethical decision generates a short-term positive outcome, the organization perceives it as effective, rewards it, and it becomes the new standard.
And the cycle of ethical fading becomes institutionalized. The average executive conforms to the new, lower ethical norm.
Okay, so we've established that normal is arbitrary statistical conformity, and that this conformity is easily manipulated to facilitate massive moral and ethical lapses. Now, we need to shift our lens to a really contemporary application. How this statistical definition is used to define, diagnose, and often oppress the neurodivergent community today.
The foundational point here has to be the explicit recognition of the arbitrary nature of societal norms. The sources we've looked at really emphasize that the norms defining the statistical average for behavior are variable, they're arbitrary, and they're fundamentally influenced by context and culture.
They are not fixed moral truths.
Not at all. And the most powerful evidence demonstrating the danger of pathologizing based on norms is the historical context of the DSM and ICD. We only have to look back a few decades.
Right. Historically, homosexuality was classified as a pathological disorder, included in earlier versions of the DSM and ICD.
It was treated as a mental illness because it deviated from the statistical norm of heterosexual behavior.
And it was removed from these manuals not because science discovered some new brain function.
No, it was because societal norms shifted. The consensus decided it was an aspect of normal human difference, not a disease.
That transition is just a stunning demonstration of the danger inherent in using the majority's statistical behavior as the yardstick for health or pathology. If a norm changes, the diagnosis just vanishes.
Which shows the entire enterprise is structurally biased toward the majority. We also see this danger historically in interventions like applied behavior analysis or ABA. The concept of social validity was heavily used.
And that meant traits considered socially unacceptable by the majority were targeted for eradication.
Exactly. Interventions were used to eliminate gay behaviors in earlier decades. This really underscores the uncomfortable truth that societal norms are only as ethical or as sound as the society that creates them.
In this philosophical conflict, using statistical averages to define impairment is perfectly illustrated by the story of Leo, the 7-year-old.
Right, so imagine Leo. He has hypervigilance, intense peripheral awareness. He notices every sensory detail, the humming of the lights, the texture of the carpet, the subtle shift in the teacher's tone.
Now picture Leo in a hunter-gatherer society.
His traits would make him an essential asset. A high-functioning member, maybe a sentinel or a successful hunter. His traits would be normal, maybe even highly advantageous.
But drop Leo into the modern classroom.
The modern classroom. It's a microsociety built for industrial age efficiency. Linear focus, prolonged stillness, filtering out sensory data. This environment is built for the statistical average neurotype.
And because Leo's brain type is a minority statistic, his functional behaviors clash violently with the environment's demands.
And so he's instantly labeled disordered or neurodivergent. His hypervigilance, which would save his tribe in the forest, causes him significant functional impairment in the school system. He's the outlier, not because his brain is fundamentally broken,
but because his pattern of engagement doesn't match the statistically preferred pattern of the majority.
This highlights the deep conflict in diagnostic criteria. DSM-5 and ICD-11, they rely on behaviorally defined symptoms and use highly deficit-focused language disorder, impairment.
They define this impairment as behavior outside the limits of normal variation.
But if that normal variation is defined by the majority group, the system is structurally designed to pathologize the minority.
So the neurodiversity paradigm is a direct philosophical challenge to this statistical oppression.
It is. Proponents argue that relying on arbitrary societal norms for clinical diagnosis is flawed and often oppressive. If the boundaries between neurotypicality and neurodivergence are constantly determined by the majority, marginalized groups will always struggle to achieve full inclusive status.
But the discussion is nuanced, right? The goal isn't to pretend that sensory processing differences or executive function challenges don't exist.
Not at all. Identification of neurodivergence is still crucial because it provides self-understanding and ensures clinicians recommend appropriate, non-harmful interventions. However, the definition of impairment needs to shift dramatically.
The core of the neurodiversity argument is that identity is a difference, not a deficit.
Yes, the difficulties experienced by the neurominority, the sensory overload, the social communication gaps, are often not inherent failures of the individual, but consequences of living in a world built exclusively for the neurotypical majority. They are experiencing a mismatch between their neurotype and the environment.
And that is the revolutionary part, shifting the onus for change. If the difficulty is caused by the mismatch, the neurodiversity paradigm seeks to shift the focus from fixing the person to adapting the environment.
Absolutely. The idea is captured perfectly by this equation I saw. Autism plus environment equals outcome.
Okay.
If the environment is rigid, noisy, and socially demanding, the outcome is stress and impairment. If the environment is flexible, supportive, using visual supports, written communication, providing noise reduction, the outcome is competence and inclusion.
So in this paradigm, compliance is not the goal.
No. The goal is supportive environments, prioritizing accommodation over deficit-focused interventions aimed at forcing the individual to mimic the majority's behavior.
So the ultimate cost of defining normal, statistically, is twofold. First, it allows the average person to rationalize moral atrocity through conformity. And second, it forces us to spend resources pathologizing and attempting to fix perfectly functional brains like Leo's simply because they don't conform to a system designed for industrial convenience.
Rather than recognizing the system itself is arbitrary and needs to expand.
Exactly.
So we started this deep dive by confronting the uncomfortable certainty that the average human is, statistically, a highly efficient conformity machine.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The data, spanning from the Aztec requirement for a child's heart to Milgram's quantification of lethal obedience, 65%, to the corporate boardrooms where ethical fading makes misconduct the norm. It all confirms a fundamental truth.
Which is that normal people do what authority commands, what roles require, and what groups normalize.
Yes. And the most profound confirmation of this whole thesis comes not just from the findings of those conformity studies, Milgram, Stanford, Asch, but from the subsequent institutional reaction to them, what we can call the banning paradox.
The paradox is stunning. After the research revealed this horrifying truth that ordinary educated citizens are so easily compelled into cruelty or denial, the academic and institutional world,
reeling from the realization of human fallibility,
they essentially chose to ban the research that proved it.
They didn't ban conformity. They banned the study of conformity.
Right. Institutions and ethics boards, which, by the way, operate entirely on principles of obedience to authority and consensus, they shifted the focus onto the distress of the participants and the unethical nature of deception.
And this successfully made Milgram, Stanford, and similar research virtually impossible to replicate under modern ethical standards.
So they used the very mechanisms the research exposed, obedience to the authority of ethics boards and conformity to the new consensus that the research was problematic,
to shut down the research that demonstrated the immense danger of obedience and conformity. They chose institutional self-protection over the uncomfortable truth about human nature.
And this action, this institutional recoil, it served to protect the comfortable, widespread delusion of individual moral exceptionalism.
The belief held by your friend at the coffee shop.
Exactly. The belief that I would have been the one to resist. They protected the idea that individual conscience overrides situational pressure, despite the overwhelming data to the contrary.
The statistical average person is not a moral crusader. They are a compliant bystander, perfectly calibrated to align with local rules, assigned roles, and group consensus, regardless of the moral dictates involved.
So the challenge for us is not achieving moral perfection in some hypothetical vacuum, but simply recognizing that the default human setting is conformity, and that profound, conscious, sustained ethical vigilance is required to ever become the statistical minority who truly resists.